So friends, welcome. My name is Stephen Fetter, and I manage the United in Learning program for the General Counsel Office. And it's a privilege and a delight to be with you today and to welcome you into this conversation among colleagues as we continue to think about all of the different questions we need to explore as we move into the next stage in this pandemic and our church response. Thank you. As we gather, Martha, no, we're not going to be in small groups today. Thanks for asking. We've got so much to talk about. I think we'll stay in plenary the whole time. But thank you for your question. As we gather, I'd like to invite you, if you please, to name the Aboriginal territory that you're sitting in today. This is something we need to do every time we gather. It's important to remember that the land that we're sitting on all across the country has been loved and nurtured and nourished by people for thousands and thousands of years, long before my ancestors came to this land. I always find it tremendously moving to see all of these territories emerge on the chat one after the other so quickly like this. I'm coming to you today from the town of Aurora, north of Toronto. So I'm acknowledging the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Thank you for your comments and for the fact that you know where you are and who cared for this land before we came. Also want to take a moment to invite God into the midst of this. This is the candle that I use for every worship service with my congregation these days. And I think as we gather, it's important to remember that we gather as colleagues, we gather as friends, we also gather as people of God. And so take a moment as we gather to think about all of the people in your congregations and the ministry to which you are each called. Think about the impact this pandemic is having on the ministries that you lead. Think about the questions that you bring, the concerns that you have, and our need to invite God into the conversation. If you have a candle beside you the way I do, you might want to light yours at the same time as I light mine. Because we gather not just as colleagues or as friends, but as God's people. We are strengthened and guided by the light of Christ, which inspires us and lights our path forward. We are not alone. Thanks be to God. Let me invite my colleagues who are presenting today to turn their cameras on so that you can all see them. Fred, I'm going to turn your camera off because you're not a presenter, but thank you, and we're glad you're here. So let me introduce you to a whole cast of characters today who are going to help me noodle through some of the different aspects of this topic today. So first of all, on my left is Kathy Davies. Kathy's the Pastoral Relations Minister in the Pacific Mountain region. And as you know, it's the regional councils that give primary direction to churches around these kinds of issues. So we wanted to include one of the regional staff in our workshop today. Frequently, we're going to be saying to people, here are the questions we think you might want to consider. Go and check with your region to get the appropriate provincial advice, because the provincial regulations vary from province to province, and it's our regional staff who are staying most on top of those things. So Kathy is here and is going to share a little bit about what's happening in British Columbia and Western Alberta, and we're delighted to have you with us, Kathy, and we'll turn things over to you in just a sec. Katja Brittain works with the Toronto United Church Council, which is an extension council here in Ontario, works with several of the different regional councils. And she has particular expertise in the area of property and tenants and tenant leases and those kinds of things. And so she'll have valuable experience to offer us as we explore that aspect of all these topics. Adam Hanley and Bronwyn Corlett work with the Office of Vocation, and they're here to bring that perspective and help us to think about the impact on the pandemic and all of these decisions for those of us who are ministry personnel. And Angelica is with our Human Resources Department at the General Counsel Office, and she will bring that set of expertise into our conversation. So yeah, Brian's noticing my red banner behind me for Pentecost. I suppose I ought to be switching to white for Trinity Sunday this week. I just haven't got there yet. But yeah, you're welcome to my church from last Sunday. The shirt too. Yeah, there you go. I put on a blue check shirt earlier and it was all moving with the video, so I had to switch to a solid color just to do that. So let me share with you briefly our agenda for today, just so that you get a sense of where we're wanting to go. Want to open by revisiting that critical incident curve that Susan Lukey introduced to us several weeks ago now, maybe 5 or 6 weeks. I can't remember. If you were on the line with us then, you'll remember it. If not, it'll be new to you, but it's a useful way to think about where we are in the midst of this crisis. And Adam and Bronwyn are going to invite us to do some reflection on what's changed since Susan first introduced this to us, where we are, and do some thinking about then ministry leadership strategies for the point where we are now. Then we need to think, kind of revisit some of the issues we talked about last week in terms of what do we need to think about as we prepare to reopen our buildings. Kathy Davies is going to walk us through a document that they're using on the West Coast. She helped to author that, and it's comprehensive and valuable and easy to read. So looking forward to what she has to say, and that should spark us into some useful conversation. And I hope you'll bring your questions and your concerns from your region and from your congregation into that conversation as she tells you kind of what they're advising in that part of the country. Then we need to delve a little deeper into 3 different areas, I think, of church work. The first of them is going to be about building and property questions, and we'll talk with Katja a little bit about the advice that she's giving us and the suggestions she has for that. We need to talk about personnel issues. If we're reopening our buildings, we have staff we need to take care of, and staff may have personal needs that we need to consider as we're going through that. So there'll be some personnel questions that we want to raise, and Angelica is here to help us wend our way through some of that, and Adam and Bronwyn as well. And then finally, we need to do a little bit of thinking about programmatically, how do we respond to where we are now? Now, I had hoped we would find a worship specialist who could give us the right answer on exactly how we ought to be structuring our worship services now. You know what, we're all still making this up as we go along. So I thought we would spend some time together sharing just some ideas around, gosh, we're now into the 11th week of the pandemic and it's not going away anytime soon. We've done some initial pivoting, we've responded to the immediate emergency, but there's a long road still ahead of us. Maybe there are some new things we want to share with colleagues in the closing minutes of today's webinar. So that's the shape of it. That's kind of where we're going today. And as we go along, if you've got questions, thoughts, comments to add, issues you want to raise, if you think we're making a mistake, like none of us are public health officials, for example. We may well get something wrong, and when there are 100 of us on the line, we'll get more wisdom than when you just have 4 or 5 of us talking. So add your comments, add your thoughts, add your corrections. Let's together find the truth that emerges from 100 minds at work together. And with that introduction, let me turn things over to Adam and invite you to tell us or remind us about this curve that Susan shared with us some time ago.
Sure. Thanks, Stephen. So I'm grateful to my colleague Susan Lukey, who introduced this curve to me at probably about the same time as she introduced it to those who have been faithfully watching these webinars for the last many weeks. Susan is in ministry at High River United Church in Alberta and is the chair of a group I've been working with since before the pandemic in response to a proposal to the last General Council on what do we do in the midst of a disaster and what sort of assistance and what's the plan to help the community of faith and the ministry personnel in the midst of it. So in that context, Susan shared this, what I think is a helpful curve with that working group as we continue our work and look at it through the lens of this current time. So the bottom axis is time, and the other axis on the left is the kind of sense of community cohesion as I understand this curve and as Susan has taught it to me. And so the curve kind of begins impact in heroic phases, particularly in a local or community emergency, where the impact of the emergency is felt and there's the instant response by emergency officials in your local jurisdiction. I think as we translate this to the pandemic, it could be the time in early March when states of emergency started being named and the World Health Organization named this as a pandemic in our world. There's lots of energy and community cohesion in that time, and the community can feel that they move to a honeymoon phase where everyone has a short-lived sense of optimism and there's really tight community cohesion. And then that only lasts for a bit of time, and then there's a sense of moving to the disillusionment phase where the realization is that folks will still be living in the experience of the emergency or the disaster for longer than they thought, that their lives are no closer to getting back to any sense of normal. There can be trigger events and can bring on a sense of trauma felt during the initial stages of the emergency, and the sense of the help and the support that folks felt really early on kind of starts to disappear. And then folks move to the reconstruction phase, where folks start to work through their grief and take some responsibility for their recovery and start to adjust to the new situation in the midst of the reconstruction phase. So as I look at this curve, I've started to reflect on my own self of not only community cohesion, but kind of where's the energy, where are you feeling? So I know Stephen does have some questions for us to wonder about where we are in this time in relation to the curve.
Sure, I was just going to invite people to add to the chat. Where do you think you are personally on that curve? Does that describe where you're at? Do you does that feel right to you? And if so, where do you put yourself at this point in the whole process? So just take a moment to think that through and add your own comments to the chat about that. We'll talk about it. Tori says, not sure I ever reached the honeymoon. Yeah. So if there was a peak, we're coming down the other side. Anger, says Beth. Want to reconstruct, says Peter. I'm reading this because the folks on YouTube can't read the chat. So I'm just kind of pull out some representative comments here. Sung Ran's still in the honeymoon. But Jane, sorry, Elaine, somewhere between disillusionment and reconstruction. Disillusionment, says Jane. Sliding down the right, says Judith. Russell says disillusionment can also be phrased as realism, especially since different people have different requirements. Well, Felicia says, one of my congregations is getting serious about closure. So Ian says disillusionment, and he has a key question unasked here so far. How do we push our governments to adopt the goal of elimination of the virus? And then how do we figure out how to get there like New Zealand did? He doesn't think we're doing nearly as well as China has. Honeymoon has been brief, says Wanda. Disillusionment now. Reconstruction on the horizon, says Jane. But just realizing how difficult it'll be. I think this is really valuable, folks, because when we start asking questions about how to reopen our buildings, we're asking questions about the reconstruction side. And to be able to name that emotionally, psychically, we're not quite there yet is important. We maybe are seeing that we need to think about it, but to name where we're at, that's really valuable and important. So we're ministry colleagues, right? What are we doing about this? To take care of ourselves in the middle of this. It's hard to preach good news when you're feeling disillusioned. What are you doing right now to kind of cope with, manage the disillusionment that is necessarily part of the curve and where a lot of us find ourselves right now? Bronwyn, why don't you read some of these so I don't have to read them all? We can have different voice commenting what's coming up here. I will open your mic. There you go.
Sure, there we go. They are flipping by quickly. So going on a silent retreat next week. A lot of iterations of the cycle, both personally and in the church. Gardening. I know a lot of people have been gardening and enjoying the nicer weather. Playing tennis. That's nice. Trying to find out the learnings and how that will inform the future. And it will be different. Okay, and we've got somebody considering amalgamation, possible closure. Reconstruction planning helps to deal with disillusion. A coffee hour online after church to connect. Oh, yeah, Beth would like to go to PI, but they don't want out of province visitors. I know that's a big issue, travel for several people, and how to take vacation at this time. I think that's a crucial one. Trying to normalize things, planning cautiously, crying every so often. I think there's a few of us doing that. Looking for the good in what we've managed to do so far in ministry regarding Zoom and keeping in touch with people. Yes, we have to remember to celebrate. Oh, a wine and cheese party. I like that idea. Online wine and cheese. Yeah, how to take the second best vacation and how to get excited about it.
Yeah, I've been wondering about vacation. What are you folks doing for a vacation? Is this I mean,
Yeah.
we need the downtime, so how are we going to do that this year?
Absolutely.
Yeah, what folks are chiming in with what they're doing for vacation, just as we think of the curve, I also wonder kind of how it fits with a change curve where we always notice that the leaders can be at a different place than the community of faith. And so, you know, if ministry personnel are feeling disillusioned, are the leaders in your community still at honeymoon, or are they at a different place than you?
Certainly there are leaders in my church that are just champing at the bit to put this all behind us and get back to quote normal. And the idea that we're not returning to 2019, as the public health person said last week, that feels really uncomfortable to the leaders in my church.
That they will stay. I'm seeing a lot of staycation planning going on here.
And I'm also seeing a comment by Kate Crawford that I'm sure is shared by many folks who had been planning sabbaticals. It's often a popular sabbatical time post Easter, and what does that mean for levels of exhaustion that are probably only compounded by COVID, and still looking for time for renewal when leadership's being called out in a new way, but the energy is waning.
Yeah, I think the sabbatical is a really hard question, because if you were ready for a sabbatical, you are probably even more ready now for a sabbatical. So what does that look like, especially if we remain in this time for a while yet, of not being able to travel or being online? I think that's a concern.
I think one of the important things for coming out of this for me is acknowledging how many of us are at the disillusionment portion of this. We've put enormous amount of energy into pivoting, into creating programming and new ways of doing things. And some of our experiments worked and some of them fell flat, and some of us are just plain exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't fixed everything. And it's still here. And simply to be able to name that that's where many of us are helps you feel like you're not alone in the middle of it. This is where we're living. One of the things I find uncomfortable about this curve, but probably realistic, is that the sense of community cohesion is going to go down even further before it comes back up again. It's going to go down even below where it was before this whole thing started. What is below the line, says Judith? Good question.
I was just thinking that, Judith. I was wondering that myself.
But to know that that is human and normative and part of what we're facing as leaders is going to help us feel a little bit less like this is a personal failure, right? It's not my fault when people stop coming to my Zoom services. It's normal. I'm not the one to blame when the attendance goes down because it was much higher at Easter than it is now. Not my fault. Not a sign that I'm a bad leader. Not a sign that I'm doing it wrong. Just an acknowledgement that that's where they are on the curve too.
Yeah.
I think we can get so tied up as caregivers in measuring our own success by the sort of immediate impact. To be able to see the power of this curve gives us some permission to carry on and
No,
to
Steve,
cry when we need to.
That's right.
And not to feel like we're the only ones that are screwing it up.
And Steve, it's not your fault that YouTube doesn't like you. I agree. Absolutely. I had an issue with Zoom today, trust me.
I keep saying it's created good, but it's fallen and in need of redemption.
That's right. I'm seeing a good suggestion from Robert Hayes that staff have booked holiday time and are able to actually pre-record services, and their youth leader is also able to pre-record youth activities so that when they're on holiday, there are services available for people. So that's a lot of work before you go on vacation, but I guess if it means you get some time off, that might be good. I also saw further up, we've got lots of wonderful input here. Some people concerned for family members that they can't get to because of non-essential travel. And so there's concerns that what I perhaps saw there in some of those comments is that as soon as things do open up, like that's going to be the vacation time, is visiting vulnerable family members. So that's another pastoral concern for clergy and everyone, I guess. Clergy support, that's wonderful to see.
I think it's also important to name what we're starting to hear in the press all the time, that doing all of these remote technology communications is exhausting. A Zoom meeting is more tiring than a face-to-face meeting. It just is. I came out of my last Zoom meeting last night about 7:15 and I could hardly see straight. I was just exhausted. I went upstairs and stared at the television while I ate my supper and realized by 8:30 I couldn't keep my eyes open. I went to bed. This is not me, but it's part of it. And it's part of it for all of us, and it's part of it for the people we lead as well, for our congregation members.
Steve was invited to a Zoom meeting to engage on how not to be depressed by Zoom meetings.
So maybe one of the things, I mean, Therese says, I'm the only tech person currently doing all the Zoom and YouTube posts and recording services.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of the challenge, right? If we're going to be doing this for longer than just a couple of weeks, maybe it's time to start sharing that. I discovered, much as I'm comfortable in Zoom, and I'm more comfortable in Zoom than almost anybody I know, I can't run the tech and also lead the worship at the same time. I get myself all mixed up, and either I push the wrong buttons or I stop being present to the people I'm talking to. So in my worship services, I've got a member of my congregation who's doing everything that I do for these webinars.
Training some volunteers. I'm happy to say it's back a little bit, but Leslie Ward shared that this time has actually, through Zoom groups, has actually helped a newly amalgamated congregation bond. So that's interesting. That's good to hear.
There's always the both and, right?
Yeah.
There's the good and the bad.
Yeah. And the access to Zoom I've seen, yes, people are naming. Missing
so we
contact.
could spend our whole time kind of talking about this, and that would not be a waste of time. But we do have other resource people too that we wanted to bring in and share some other perspectives on. But this is important. And in the midst of all that we have to plan for and all that reconstruction stuff that we know as leaders we need to think about, let's acknowledge where we are psychically. We have to do the planning before we really feel hopeful. And right now, a lot of us aren't feeling hopeful, and yet as leaders, we still have to do some of that planning. Kathy, I'm going to invite you to turn your camera on. There's your audience. Give us some hope.
Also, I've got to also unmute. That is quite the invitation.
Yeah, well,
I was
there
just
you go.
thinking again, how do I start this? In the midst of all of this that everyone has shared, the exhaustion, the disillusionment, the little sprigs of hope that are there, but now we're being asked to adapt again, right?
We are, and I think that's important, is that this whole emergency is one adaptation after another. And we're not being asked simply to resume what we used to do. We're being asked for yet another adaptation. Maybe that is a helpful way in.
Yeah. I think like it's a whole new pivot. We talked about that idea of pivoting when the pandemic was first named, and now pivoting again as we reimagine what it means to reopen our in-person ministries.
And you know what? I mean, maybe it's a gift that we can do that pivot in the summertime. Like we did the last pivot in the most important season of the church year, right? I mean, we were all scrambling to do Holy Week services and Easter when folks were just scrambling. Now we've got the summer, and generally things slow down.
I think that's a really important piece to remember as you're doing this, is that there is time to do this. I know there is a lot of urgency, and I can talk a little bit about that as well, but there is time to do this kind of planning and discernment well. So making sure that we actually do take that time to enter into this.
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge different provinces are at very different stages around that timing. I mean, I know you folks in BC are starting to very seriously go back into your sanctuaries. We're not allowed to have gatherings of more than 5 people in Ontario. And so part of why we wanted to invite someone from BC to talk to the nation is because you're ahead of the curve. You're ahead of the rest of us. Tell us what you're learning. Sure. Tell us what you had to think about, because you had to do all of this stuff a little sooner than many of the rest of us did. And let's learn from your experience.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I think like all the churches across Canada, we are asking those questions: when and how do we proceed with this reopening? It's not going back to normal, as we know. And I also want to change it from reopening our church to kind of re-engaging our in-person ministries. Our churches didn't close, but we are needing to look at what does it mean for our in-person groups, worship, small groups, meal programs, outreach, thrift shops, all of those times when we are gathering. And instead, every province is in a different phase. Maybe they are in or moving into a phase 2. Stores, restaurants, hair salons, gyms, schools, they're all starting to develop plans in our neighborhoods. And congregations are starting to ask, how do we assess and how do we plan for restarting some of our ministries? So I'll share a little bit about what we're doing in Pacific Mountain and some of the reasons why. And maybe if we wanted to put up the slide of the document.
There you go.
And I hope that sharing some of this will be able to assist you as you're facing these questions in your own context. So as a regional council here in the Pacific Mountain region, we created a document called Pandemic Recovery and In-Person Ministry Relaunch Guidelines. And I think there is a link going to be provided. It's on the Pacific Mountain region webpage if you want to find it.
And I have put a link up with the recording to this webinar at United in Learning too. So you can get the full 12-page document. It's really good.
Right. So we
I
based
can
this
say
on...
that because she wrote it. So
we based it on guidelines from the United Church. So I know the United Church of Canada has guidelines on its website as well. So making sure you check those out. So we use those guidelines as well as the directives from BC on Alberta Ministries of Health, as well as WorkSafe. And I think every provincial body probably has a body similar to WorkSafe legislation around safe work environments. Every congregation, every community of faith has its own context. And so that needs to be considered as well as all the different regulations in your area. But really where it starts, I think, is discerning your why. And that's a common thing that we can hold. What are the values and principles that form the foundation of your decision to establish these in-person ministries? What is the need that you're trying to respond to? And as you start to lay out your plans, I think it's really important to keep coming back to those questions. Some of it might involve some very challenging conversations. Are we afraid that we're going to lose members if we don't start soon? Are there financial concerns? And is that driving some of our initiative to get back into the buildings? What are the spiritual needs? And what shifts have we needed to make to help us discern how we can meet together in different ways? What will be the impact of our decisions on our most vulnerable members? This is a key one to think through. Will it put them at more risk? Will they feel left out? So as you're considering, churches are a very particular context, not the same as a restaurant or a store, or partly because of our demographics, partly because of what we serve in our communities. So really, safety of the staff, the volunteers, the church members, and all of those that we serve has to be held at the core of any of our decision to reopen in-person activities. It is more important even maybe than considering the building questions. Right? What will meet this need? What will be some of the unintended consequences? And how do we keep coming back to those to inform our decision? Another thing that we've highlighted is that everyone will have experienced this pandemic differently. And thus there'll be a wide variety of responses to the idea of a return. So it's really important that we're kind to each other in that. And there will be people who have lost members of their family from coronavirus or from other causes. We even saw in the chat that people are waiting to have memorials and funerals planned. They haven't been able to do that gathering with their families. Others are waiting. And people are going to be coming back from this pandemic in a whole variety of states. Some will have suffered, maybe financially, poor mental health, strained relationships. So how do we be mindful of that as we enter into these planning stages? So as you discern all of your why, which is really key, you also need to assess your risk. And maybe if we can go to the next slide, Stephen. So this is a simple metric from the Ministry of Health in BC, and it tries to make it really simple. You look at the contact intensity and the number of contacts. So how many people will be present at the same time, and for how long will they be in contact with each other? The more people and the longer the duration of contact, the more risk. So you're assessing that when you're looking at your programming. You're assessing your building and your maintenance capacities. You're considering your staff, your volunteer, and your participant capacity. Will this require extra workload, more volunteers to do cleaning? Like what is all the impact on your staff and volunteers requiring? And how does that impact your decision? Considering the demographics of your participants. Again, we often serve folks that are in the more vulnerable categories for COVID. So how do we pay attention to that in our decisions? So all of these factors influence the degree of risk that we're facing, and that's how we are looking at these planning. So you're assessing your level of risk. And then maybe we'll go to the next slide. And again, this I'm not going to go through, so you probably can't even see it. It's actually through WorkSafe BC, but it talks about how do you then reduce the risk. So as you're developing your plan, use all the resources that are going to be provided through here, as well as your provincial governments on how you can reduce the risk and how you can meet the requirements of your own particular jurisdiction. Though essentially recognizing worship and in-person ministries, using all of these risk mitigation procedures are not going to. That's really important as you do this. So how are you going to communicate your new practices and expectations to your participants? What if some people decide they're not going to follow the directives? Are you prepared to explain as well as to ensure safety? So that would be step 2. So you've looked at your why, you've assessed some of your risk, and now you need to make a plan. And if you, I'm not going to read through all of the planning in the document. You can certainly look at that because it is different in every context. But here in Pacific Mountain, we also did this discerning regionally. And at this point, given the inherent social nature of our community of faith events, the prolonged exposure of participants attending events, the demographics of our communities of faith as being those in higher risk, and all of the safety protocols required to ensure reduced risk, Pacific Mountain Regional Council is not recommending expanding to stage 2 at this time. So we're staying at a stage where we have some small group ministries starting to open up, staff starting to enter into buildings with all of the precautions and plannings in place. And we're doing this even though our health minister, or not health minister, our health, the head of our health department, Dr. Bonnie Henry, provincial health officer, has said religious gatherings of up to 50 people are allowed. Our assessment is that the risk of that outweighs the benefit of in-person gatherings at this time. But individual communities of faith are doing their own discerning. So they're assessing the risk, they're developing plans to meet the needs and the requirements of the provincial health jurisdiction. And regional ministers are available to help throughout that process. And I think throughout the region, there are people at national churches as well as within all the regions who can assist congregations as they start to look at their own context. We're lucky in both Alberta and BC, the ministries of health have put out guidelines for faith communities, so we are still following those as well. And there's more information about that in the document about, and I think, Stephen, you're going to refer to a lot of this later, no singing, no communion, how to do these things differently. So those guidelines have come out from ministries of health. But again, just encourage you to access the resources through your provincial governments as well as the ones that are going to be provided from this workshop. And I don't know if there's questions that I can help to answer. That might be the better way to.
What I really appreciated about what you folks have done on the West Coast is invite congregational leaders into risk assessment. And so that we're not simply following rules, although following rules is important, but we're asking the deeper question of, this might be lawful, but is it valuable? Is it the best way through? And it makes me think of St. Paul, right? All things are lawful, not all things are helpful. Well, not all things are even lawful right now, but even if they are, is it faithful? Is it valuable? Is there a safer way to achieve enough of the same ends that we should be thinking twice? So that's really what impressed me about your document, and I hadn't seen that. I mean, that's not what the governments are talking about, right? They're saying here's the minimum that you have to do in order to stay safe. You're asking the more theological duty of care questions, and I commend that doc to everybody online to have a chance to look at with your congregational leaders as you sort through it. What jumps out at you folks as you've had a chance to hear her? Go ahead. Sorry, Kathy.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to add too that it's really important that people don't do this alone. So making sure that a minister in a congregation isn't feeling the pressure to make all this decision on their own, that they work with their elders and their leaders to do that discerning process together for their own context.
was a little concerned last week when we started talking about this, that there were some ministers online who were feeling a lot of pressure from their congregational leaders to go faster than they were comfortable. I wonder if taking a risk assessment approach is a helpful way in for some of those folks. But what are you noticing, folks online? Let's have some conversation about this. Steve says we could, but should we? Is where my congregation is regarding many things. Trish is talking about guidelines in Saskatchewan that were created with the guidance of faith leaders task group. Helpful.
As I see the question about day camp. So in BC, the Camp Spirit is running this summer in congregations as a day camp, but they've had to, again, they're doing all of that, and they've made significant changes to their program to balance that, assessing the risk and serving the needs of the children and community.
Pam's got a steering committee that meets every Monday to discuss all these issues. Jennifer says she's been leading worship from home and many want her to lead it from the church, even though they're not there. So that might be a midway step. I've been kind of wondering about that. If and when we're allowed to have a few people in our sanctuary, maybe I should go down to the church and lead worship from there so that the people without internet access can see what we're doing on Zoom. I've been wondering whether that's a midway point. I haven't decided yet, but it's one of the options I've been talking about with my board.
So that's a slightly different thing. So churches, the buildings in BC didn't actually ever close in the same way that they have in other places across the province. So that has been an option for some congregations to do a taped worship.
Sure.
But again, we're really sticking to small groups. We are not.
Even in Ontario, we're allowed to have up to 5 people in the building to tape a worship service.
Right.
As long as we're appropriately socially distancing, but we can't be open for business. Russell says the primary pressure for us is financial. We need the rents. Yeah, my congregation does too. Our income has dropped from about 18,000 a month to about 6. And that's partly why we wanted to talk with Katja about rents. And Katja is here to kind of respond to some of those questions too. So rents are one of the things we need to a little more talking about. The comments are coming fast and furious now. I can't read them all. But lots of people are saying small groups, only 20 to attend. Boards are determining policies. Beth says her income isn't down enough to apply for help. Lucky you. Our givings are up, which is lovely. It's just that they're only a portion of our budget. Felicia, if you're looking for advice for your treasurer, go on to the United in Learning recorded webinar section and look at the most recent webinar from the in the Congregational Finances series. Excellent, very practical advice for treasurers, and we've had up to 1,000 treasurers online live for those webinars and another couple of thousand watching the recordings afterwards. There's excellent, very specific advice for treasurers on the wage subsidy programs and on the rent subsidy programs and all of the rest. So we don't need to rehearse those details in this webinar because it's all available in recording already. Let me show you one more tool that actually Angelica put together for us. I don't know that we have time to talk through it. There's a lot of text on that page, but I've put a copy of that at the United in Learning website with this recording too. And it might be a useful tool to take into a board or council meeting. It gives you a whole bunch of categories of questions to ask as you start to work with your leaders about things we need to think about as we move into the next step of that crisis response curve. So I commend that to you. But there's so much text on the screen. If I leave it up, you'll read it and stop listening to us. So go have a look at that as well as Kathy's document. Any specific questions you'd like to ask Kathy about the process or the things that they've been learning in BC? Anything that you'd like to kind of get her wisdom on before we invite Katja on to talk to us about buildings and tenants and rents and those kinds of things? Jane says one thing I've missed as we're operating on when we're operating our buildings, readers are recruited, choir and music are all in place. Of course, we won't have the latter when we go into the sanctuary, she says, and tech support from someone who's not me is going to have to be in place to enable playing of music and so on. Yeah, absolutely. I think the person who is doing tech support for me in my congregation is going to continue to do it from home by Zoom. He's enough immune compromised that I don't want him coming into the sanctuary, but he can still run the Zoom meeting from his house.
There's a couple quick questions here about singing. So that's been a big question. And essentially we have taken the advice of the health authority that there be no congregational singing. So if people are gathering, there's no congregational singing. There is an allowance for some solo singing, and they should be, and there's mixed data on this, but we're saying at least twice as far from the congregation. So
yeah,
that's where it's different.
I've heard 16 feet for
right.
singers.
It's a different experience of worship. So that's really what's important to recognize as well. And somebody asked about Sunday school, I think.
Yeah,
and
I sing
so
in
we're
a
not
community
even having
choir. We've canceled our whole season next year because it's not safe for 100 people to get into a church basement and rehearse. Sunday school, we're doing Sunday school online. I would follow all of the regulations for daycares. If we get to the point in my church of restarting Sunday school, the provincial regulations on daycares are extensive, and daycares will likely open before churches do because people need childcare so they can go back to work. So I think there's excellent advice from our provincial authorities about how to work with kids. Leslie says we have space for 50, so which 50 do we permit to attend? In my daughter's congregation in St. Louis, they've divided it up and said if your name starts in the first half of the alphabet, come on the first and third Sundays of the month. And if your name starts in the second half, come on the second and fourth. I guess that's one way to do it.
And we have had some congregations experimenting with holding outdoor services. Again, using the same regulations, that there has to be able to be social distance using the same risk assessment tools. But outside is better than inside. So.
Part of the issue is will people actually follow the social distancing regulations when we tell them to? I mean, Jane has warned people, no singing, no handshakes, no hugs, physical distance, definitely no choir, no shared coffee, no treats, no mingling. Those are all the reasons people come. You take all those away, why would they come at all? Virtual choirs. Jane, I've been doing virtual choirs with my congregation, and boy, are we ever having fun. So some of the questions that are coming up now are logistical ones. And for me, the model is still what we're seeing in commercial establishments. Somebody standing at the door of Home Depot, not allowing more than 50 people in the building. We just stand in line. Kathy, what are you doing for Sunday school?
Like I say, most of our worships have not started up. They're continuing online. And we have started the Camp Spirit summer program, day program will be starting up, but they've massively changed their program structure. I think they're keeping, one of the things they're doing is keeping small groups of 6, keeping with the same leaders. So there's lots of things to mitigate risk. It's the same idea. And then most congregations I'm hearing are continuing to do online. So youth group meeting online. So finding ways to keep, to mitigate any of the risk.
For video editing for virtual choirs, Russell, I'm using a program called DaVinci Resolve. It's free. It's the best video editor I have ever seen in the free category. And yeah, I'm just learning it, but boy, we're having fun with it. My community choir did a virtual choir, and I asked the person who pulled it together what program she used, and that was the one she used. It's made by Blackmagic. There is a paid version, but the free version is entirely adequate. So if you've got the interest in the skills, it's kind of fun to play with. I think we should bring Katja in because we've got a whole other constellation of building questions that I want to make sure we get to as well. So Katja, if you'd like to turn your camera on, thank you.
Hello, everyone.
One of the big issues that's come up here is the same one that I was talking to you about earlier, and that was around tenancies. And if our tenants like daycares are going to be allowed to come back into the buildings even before we are, what kinds of obligations do we have as landlords, and what kinds of expectations do we need to be thinking about, or putting rules do we need to put into place with respect to the tenancies?
So I'd like to make sure from the beginning, when you talk about tenancies, you mean what I would call exclusive users. So they have a separate space in your building, potentially even their separate entrance, as opposed to what I would call the book club or the yoga club or someone like that. But let's start with the tenancies who, as you said, will most likely come in earlier. And that can be the child care provider or other providers who are providing social services of whatever type. The difference when they come back in, I think, or the additional thing that you need to think about is addenda to 2 documents that you have established with them. And that is, for once, the lease and the T's and C's, so the terms and conditions for your building usage. These 2 documents need to include whatever these, so the lease agreement needs to include specific details that might come into play now that new regulations have been put in place. So clear reference to whoever is providing guidelines there. So that's the United Church, the Regional Council, but then also if it happens to be a childcare provider, then it's the provincial regulations. These things, all COVID-19 related regulations, need to be mentioned there, that they have to be abided to. The T's and C's of building usage, for example, if your childcare provider actually has to, so either usually your staff, the children, will enter the building, or the space usage outside where also parents could come in, that needs to be regulated. Your team will have to set up clear rules of how this is supposed to happen. Now, I'm saying you set the rules, but I'm recommending that you set these rules together with your tenants, because they might have ideas, and they potentially are very, very clever. They might have ideas of how they can best run the program on their side. And if that is in alignment with the rules and as you understand them for the building that you're responsible for, then obviously introduce that into the lease as well as in the T's and C's that they have to go by. that's the major new introduction, and everybody will understand that you will need to introduce these addenda because everybody is starting from fresh. So you're not surprising anyone with this. I hope that's answering your question, Stephen, as you had phrased it.
Yeah, I think so. One of the questions I got from somebody as we were thinking about this is, what about the groups that traditionally have not had exclusive use space? I mean, the daycare in my church, for example, has 2 classrooms, which is not exclusive use, but they also use our church hall, which is used by other groups for after-school programs and on Sundays. What about the groups that don't have exclusive use?
Yeah. So I call these the renters versus the tenants, but who cares what I call them? But they're obviously, you also need to introduce addenda on these in the documents that you hold with them, to specify that that new rules are being put in place. Refer to the relevant documents set on and regulations as they're set out by the relevant parties in your province, and make sure that they actually sign and agree to that. Because one thing that we discussed was, for example, that if someone it doesn't abide by these rules that they were supposed to agree to, what kind of consequences can that have? So that's another point I want to make. Include in your lease agreement and in your T's and C's that those who are not following these rules, you will spot check. That is my suggestion to those who are in welcoming these groups in their building. Do spot checks, and even if that is your janitor who goes about the cleaning of the building, allow this person to then come back to you and tell you this has happened, so that you can then go and ask the user of your building that this is not how you understand these rules, and they have to, and seriously have to, abide by them, because if, and we'll get to this I think in a bit regarding the insurance provision, but if in these circumstances that we are in now, when reopening, not abiding by the rules can have actually some consequences. That's what I think I can talk about regarding the leases, rental agreements, as well as the T's and C's of the building. I think somewhere in Kathy's introduction to risk assessment is also something like kitchens will not be used. So anyone who has kitchen usage terms and conditions, well, I'm sorry, but that's basically not part of the deal anymore, and exclude those details in the rental agreements. So
what if we are in the middle of a 3-year lease? Can you reopen it because of this pandemic? Yes. Or are we stuck by the terms that we agreed to 18 months ago?
So I would separate between the financial terms and the usage terms. And we clarified this with the lawyers. There's a difference, yeah. So because of the circumstances that you're in, and basically everybody is in. It's not, the churches are not singular here and all of a sudden have to do things differently. Everybody will understand that you need to include these addendas to your terms and to your contracts. It's a bit of a different story regarding the payments. And I thought I'll start with the basics. I think everyone understands what a church's objective is. A church's objective with the building is that you want to have this building for your own congregational activities as well as for the social good, so that you can invite other users in the building now and in the future. And it's this bit in the future that I think is important here. That is something that everyone should understand. also your other users. At the same time, you need to understand that the external users equally want to exist now and in the future. And if we understand this as the premises of any discussions you have with your external users, then let's look a little deeper at the details. And again, I'm coming back to Kathy and her analysis of benefits and risks. When you operate a building as well as any kind of business, you look at basically people, place, then process and procedures, then price and costs, and you look at communication. And so that's, you always do this. But now things in all these different, what I would call categories, will have changed. You'll run higher cost and you have less income. Your place needs to be potentially completely rejigged. For example, as Kathy was mentioning, the daycares, but also the people flow in your building, church building, will have to change. So you will end up with differences in all your different categories. And that will mean you can, my suggestion is, talk to your external users about these issues as they happen for you, and understand what their issues are, and let them voice that. And in that instance, I actually recommend that you do this one-to-one, understand in detail what the issues are, because one-to-one you can actually discuss financials. But also, if you have more than one external users, invite them all together and have them each explain to them their situation. Because my hunch is that the people will be able to share and potentially collaborate on certain matters. So, and I think what you really want to talk about is how can you renegotiate terms, even in your 3-year lease deal with your daycare. Most likely the daycare will come to you and ask for a relief, as they have potentially already done since COVID-19 started. And so we've discussed, and I don't need to talk about the rent relief program that Canada has set up, but going forward, when reopening, they will have certain financial pressures. So do you. I think it is prudent to allow for renegotiation of the terms, the financial terms, because keeping them hostage on the terms that they agreed to a couple of years ago, that's not productive for neither for you, for the relationship, or for them. So it is open up the discussion and find out where they are. What can they do? How can you support them? But also, how can they support you? In the whole time, you need to be able to understand what you need now and in the future. That usually means how much did you actually spend on operating your building pre-COVID-19 in order to then see, okay, how much will it be later on? Really, you need to know where you are. And so often I've seen people being pulled over the table in terms of they agreed to too many things. And if you do that, you're basically on the downward spiral. I cannot suggest that. But I'm rather optimistic that if you come together and if you come together and discuss what you want to do in the building, I think you can achieve much more if you're open to accepting what other people can bring to the table. Obviously, always having in mind that you need to go by the rules that the different authorities set you up for. That's not non-negotiable.
Sure. Well, and I think it's important to remember that all of our tenants are bound by the law of the land just as we are.
Correct.
So while it would be wise and prudent to have a line in every lease that says the tenant agrees to follow the law of the land, they are whether we put it in the lease or not. And that's just an important thing to remember. So I love the idea of reopening things because everybody's going to have different needs and different things to offer. The people who run the daycare in my congregation are getting no income right now, but they're cutting the grass at the church.
Yes, one thing that I've seen is so often now in the comments I've seen things like I'm the only person doing the social media, and I don't know the real circumstances behind all this, but what if you have someone in an external group that wants to use the building but actually will end up not being able to pay as much? What if someone is in that group who is actually extremely social media savvy and has been able to help you? Now, that's not an immediate money coming in. And you need to be able to discern whether that is worth your while. But maybe that enables your congregation to grow further and develop further because you get someone in who can actually make things happen and therefore reach more people. This is not an ultimate solution. It is, I mean, what do you have left? You can just try, and if it doesn't work out, then you can always say no to that. Again, you're the owner. Well, not you're the owner of the building, but you're the most responsible for the building. So you always have the opportunity to say no to something if this doesn't meet what you think is right for the building.
So two things that are coming up for me. One of them is all of the comments in the chat about cleaning and anxiety about the extra cleaning that's going to be necessary. And I think that's real. There is going to be extra cleaning. I also think it's the easy thing. It just takes a little bit of extra money or time. But this is an airborne virus, and the biggest danger is not from touching something. The biggest danger is from being too close to people. And I think, frankly, the hardest thing we're going to have when we've got people in our building is keeping them apart from each other. Not about keeping it clean. The constant reminders and policing of social distancing, I think, is going to take a whole lot more finesse and pastoral skill and constant reminders, because that's not how we behave in this setting. And the cleaning, that's just money. That's extra supplies and a little bit of extra time from our janitors. And yeah, it hurts, but the other is going to be really harder, and it's going to be even more important for preventing people from getting sick.
If you have a group that wants to come into your building, I believe that, especially exclusive usage, that's a cost. The cleaning cost is something that they should budget for. It's going to hurt them, but see, maybe Kathy, because you're further ahead, you can speak to that, but I could imagine that there will actually be coming subsidies for these kinds of extra costs.
Yeah.
Something else that I thought to mention is, I think because of the physical distance requirements, there's going to be need for large spaces. And if, so in my neighborhood where I live, there's about 4 little yoga shops. And they look like they're in someone's basement or something. These yoga shops cannot, and I talked to someone, they cannot operate they're not allowed, and they will not be for the next for the unforeseeable future. These people need space because of the physical distance requirements. What if they knock at your door? So if you are not opening for Sunday service, that means even your sanctuary will be available on Sunday for, a yoga group, if you have the space available. That I'm aware that there's people who are very uncomfortable with that, and I respect that. I'm just putting it out there as an idea.
So you're inviting us to think about the ways this could be an opportunity, and an opportunity to connect with community people and neighbors in ways that we haven't before.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, for
So-
example, invite and inform your MPs, MPPs, and your local councillor about what you're doing in order to open up, and that you're really there for the community. Tell them that.
Yeah.
Maybe they have ideas of what they could bring in.
Sure. And let me respond to Russell's comment as if I don't care about money. As I said earlier, my congregation's income has gone from 18,000 a month to 6,000 a month. The money is huge. I still think that getting people to follow the social distancing rules is harder than finding the money for extra cleaning. And it's a constant thing rather than something that happens between meetings. So, one
Yeah.
is hard, the other is even harder, I think.
Clyde, I know about this 48 hours or how long the aerosols are active. And it's actually so what I learned is the aerosols are active, and then it's not just that they drop, but also they are not that active anymore. And that means if you can keep rooms, so that's what I mean with scheduling. If you can keep space actually unused for a certain amount of time, and that would allow for to lessen the cleaning cost, at least a little bit. There's someone commenting about the elderly people. Please, with due respect, I'm not talking about elderly. Because I'm aware that vulnerable people, and that is what I believe elderly people are, I leave this up to every congregation to assess the benefits and the risk. So, and I think elderly people, in as much as they are a member of, and a strong and great member of our communities of faith, whether you allowed them in the building is completely up to you.
So the other question that was raised last week around tenants and other groups is what happens if we have a tenant group in the building that's not following the law? And, you know, we've got a congregation of a different denomination that thinks this is all hokum and state conspiracy, and they're not interested in social distancing. What do we do?
Yeah, so I had it really, I thought, man, that's actually against the law. Well, I mean, this is potentially, so if someone just talks about it, yeah, but the behavior is still okay and abiding the rules, that's one thing. That's something to talk to them about and make sure that while you cannot undo what they say, if they are not abiding by the rules, that's grounds for you to warn them, and if not happening, then terminate the contract. And I would go as far as that, terminate the contract. But I mean, so if you cannot do that if you don't warn them about this, but it's sort of warn and check.
I think that's important. And there was some concern last week about relationships and can we do that? I actually went and talked to our staff lawyer, and here's some of what she responded to me about, and I'll just put it up on the screen for everyone to read. Although the laws vary from province to province, it's unlikely a building would be closed because of the actions of a tenant. Because I wanted to know if my renters were breaking the rules, could the authorities prevent us from using the building? She said no. The legal consequences would be for the tenant, people actually breaking the rules. The tenant might be charged, fined, or ordered to cease operations at the premises, but it shouldn't affect the operations of other tenants or the building owner as long as all of them are following the rules. But, and there's the but, if we notice it, we have an obligation to take action to protect the health and safety of other tenants and members and staff of the congregation. So, and she goes on in her letter to me to say it's a good idea to be proactive, warn them if you're seeing something, call in the provincial authorities if they don't toe the line. We have that kind of a duty of care to our staff and to our members and to all the other tenants and to the people coming to their program too. So we have some responsibilities, and it's all about following the provincial regulations and ensuring that they are followed.
In the end, you're responsible for the building, and it's a private building. This is not a public space. So yeah.
And
I want to.
There's a statement from Hub Insurance that essentially says the same thing. We're insured as long as we're following the rules. They don't have special rules for us. They're following the provincial guidelines, and we have to do this too.
There's one thing I thought to talk about, and that is coming from Jane, and it's all about the air conditioning and then masks.
Sure.
I myself, this is the moment when I'm following what Stephen told me. I don't know, but I've started to inquire about that, and I think there's a difference between air conditioning and fans. So if you just have a fan that was in one corner and blows the air because summer is coming, everybody understands that this is how we operate. I don't know. I certainly know about air circulation, and that is something that we should be aware of. That's when the fan comes in terms of, is this actually dangerous or not? Even if you open the window, you start air circulation in a certain way if there's wind. Indeed, that is a risk. This is why, and you potentially hear it, I follow quite a bit the German news. So that's actually one thing that they've come up with. It's the reason why there have not been that many increases in infections in Germany is because they made it mandatory in so many different public and private areas that you have to wear masks. And that is to do with and that is actually keeping the infection away from you. And I take the point, I cannot follow now where this person said something. I think there was Heather Walton. Indeed, it's either single-use mask or a handmade one with double layer of cotton. That actually is quite helpful. We are following up on the air conditioning and fans topic, and we will get back to you. Please apologize that we don't have that to hand right now.
Sure. And again, the advice that we give here is advice, but primary and underlying it all is to say, check with your provincial guidelines. The provincial guidelines vary from province to province, and they're changing all the time because the science is changing, and we're learning more and more. Every province has specific information on buildings in COVID-19. So go to your provincial government websites or your provincial public health websites and check for the specific guidelines and keep going back, because it changes as the scientists learn more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I know that Kendra has followed up on the guidelines when she talked about fire doors. I'll get in touch with her.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions for Angelica, and then we're coming to the end of our scheduled time together. We're about 10 minutes out, which is remarkable to me. So Katja, thank you. And again, we could welcome you into this conversation for a lot longer than we had time for today, and that's fair. But at least you've helped us understand some of the questions we need to think about and given us some guidance around that. Angelica, if you could come on. You're a human resources specialist. Now, I know you didn't spend oodles of time preparing for this, but what are some of the questions that employees might have, or concerns that employees might have, and how do we as employers need to start thinking about that? So I'm not asking for the answers, because those will be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but what are the questions?
They are. So some of the most frequently asked questions is, do employers have to accommodate employees who are concerned about public transportation to get to work? That's one of the biggest. And again, it goes back to, as long as the public health authorities continue to permit public transportation to operate, then it's deemed to be safe.
Okay.
But what employers could be doing is providing flexible work hours. So employees do not feel like they have to be going to work during those very heavy traffic times. So, you know, as I've been going through a return to work and planning for the General Counsel office, it's really about listening to the employees' needs and what are their anxieties, what are their concerns, and how is it that you can best be able to support them through this. Everybody has experienced very different things. You know, from medical issues to taking care of other family members and so forth. And so it's just really, it comes down to now really, really understanding the needs of your employees and what is it that you can do. There's a lot of you know, government benefits that are there for them to access. They are protected leaves that they can access. So meaning that, you know, we as employers cannot just let them go. They will be protected if they fall under any of these COVID circumstances, whether you were ill, whether you're symptomatic, or whether you're a family member, or whether you've been exposed or you feel you are. So bottom line is they will always be protected. So now it's about, you know, answering some questions about, okay, an employee doesn't want to come to work, they want to stay home. So then again, it goes back to really assessing the risk of the workplace. Is it a high, low risk? And ensuring that the employee understands it's a low risk, depending on the position. Again, you know, what is the position? What does that look like? And lowering that risk for the employee. I mean, there's, you know, a lot of scenarios that we can talk about. And, you know, the childcare, for example, is another big one. My child's school is closed. Does my employer have to give me time off? So they're protective leaves, right? So if the position is deemed that it requires to be at the workplace, then we need to figure out how we can do that. If you're not able to, you can take unpaid leave. Right. So, I mean, again, it all goes back to what you said, you know, provincial regulations and guidelines. Every province is different and every province has different leaves. But at the end of the day is how do we accommodate this?
And as employers, we have a duty, I think, to provide the tools that our employees need to be safe, which may mean additional cleaning tools for our custodial staff, might mean providing masks for our secretaries or administrators or customer service staff.
Yeah.
Some of those kinds of things that we need to research.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you know, if you have an employee who is going to be in contact with the public, then it is our duty to provide them with a mask, with the gloves, and ensure that we have enough for our employees to access and use them if they need that protection.
And you're giving us the same kind of advice that Katja did: communication, conversation, negotiation, being flexible.
Absolutely. Being flexible, absolutely. And having those conversations and really discussing with the employee even prior to consider them coming back to the place, to the workplace, you know, and putting all of those measures in place before they come in, and ensuring that they feel comfortable coming back.
Now, all of us on the line here are leaders. Most of us are also employees. What if we don't feel comfortable? It's one thing to say we need to get gloves for the custodian, but what if I'm immunocompromised? What if it's just terrifying to be back in my office? What if the church board says we want to open the church and I'm feeling uncomfortable? What are my rights as an employee?
Well, as an employer, you have a right to ask, and as an employee, you also have that need to have that conversation. And it boils down to, are you medically immune and not able to be exposed? Then it boils down to accommodation, right? It boils down to, we follow the path when someone has an illness and someone can transmit. We boil down to what are the risks for you as an employee, and how do we best accommodate you?
Thank you. I'm looking at the time. We've got about 4 minutes left. I think we've got time for a couple of comments and questions. What about me, says Paula, being expected to be in people's personal homes offering pastoral care? Maybe there are other ways to do it.
Yeah.
All the psychiatrists I know are doing psychiatric appointments on Zoom or on the telephone. They're not meeting clients in their offices right now.
So are physicians as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're all doing by through a phone
I
call,
don't think-
through Zoom.
I think as ministers, we're expected to offer pastoral care, but we're not required to be in people's homes to do it.
Mhm, absolutely.
So part of the flexibility then is rethinking all of the tasks we do so that we can sort out how do we achieve the same ends and keep everybody safe.
It will be challenging, I do have to say. I mean, there's a lot of thinking, and as you know, General Counsel Office is not going back anytime soon because we're still in the planning stages in terms of what is it that we need to do with the physical space? What is it that we need to do to ensure that employees trust that when they come into work, they're going to feel safe?
And perhaps, Paula, at least in the summer, you can go and sit on two ends of a park bench. I'm serious. I mean, yeah, it sounds silly, but maybe you go out to the local park, or maybe you put a park bench out in the lawn of the church, and one person sits at one end and one person sits 6 feet away outside. Interesting thoughts. I would say to all of our presenters, any last minute comments, questions, thoughts, bits of encouragement?
I just saw one question come up, Stephen.
Yes.
Someone was asking about, can the minister go on the CERB? As the congregation it talked about, like financial pressure. And so the messaging is, don't rush into that. Have a lot of conversation with your regional council, pastoral relations staff people to take a look at your finances and really make sure that there are no answers. And then I also think it's important to have conversation about, well, what does that mean? Because we don't want ministers being laid off, especially the folks that have been working super hard, flat out since all of this began.
I think that's really important, Adam. And let me just emphasize that every treasurer's webinar, Eric Matheson has said, before you do any layoffs of any staff at all, talk to your regional staff. Not just the minister, but anybody at all. You need to know what the employment standards are in your province. You need to do this right, or you could be opening yourself in the church to, and the person, to all kinds of hardship that is unnecessary.
For sure. And even in Ontario, some of the employment law around temporary layoffs or emergency leave of absence is currently changing. So those folks will have the most up-to-date information on what the provincial rules are for ministry personnel and lay employees.
The last time I was called to a bedside for a dying person, I ended up doing it on a video, on a Zoom call. They were only allowing one family member in with the dying person, and I wasn't a family member, but he went in, he was with his dad, he phoned me on Zoom, and I had a conversation with him, and we said a prayer together at his dad's bedside. The man died about 4 hours later. It was tremendously moving. I've never done anything like that before. But it did the pastoral care need that he needed, and it was the best I could do for his dad, who was out of it anyway. I think it's important to remember that what people really need is connection. And there's a whole variety of ways to do that. 2 comments I'd like to leave you with. The first is that we're going to take a break from the Thursday webinars for a while. I think this is the 11th one we've done. And our goal when we started this was to help our church leaders think their way into the massive big pivot that we've made. there's lots of resources now at the United in Learning website about different ways to think about online worship and pastoral care and funerals and buildings and all of those kinds of things. We're starting to feel like we're running out of ideas for new topics and new webinars. And we don't want to just take your time if we don't have urgent brand new things to say. We're also moving into a time of the church year that is a little slower, and we've got time now to think our way into the fall and how we're going to do things, and we're all creating together. So as I say, we're going to step back from the Thursday webinars for a while, see how things go. If there are topics that emerge that you really think you'd like to talk about, we need to pursue something further, we need to go deeper into some area, drop me a line, write me a note, and we're certainly open to resuming this pattern if it will be a useful thing to do. For the next couple of weeks, I'm deeply involved in a bunch of governance meetings. I'm helping with the Region 15 annual meeting, and the General Council is being recalled, and a few other things that are going to take up a lot of my brain cells on Zoom for the next few weeks. But, you know, this is also important, and offering these kinds of skills and resources across the church in this national way has been really helpful. So we're not gone for good, but we are gone for a while we watch how things work out. And having said that, I sure want to acknowledge the wisdom on the line and the variety of comments that you have offered, and the creativity that is being called out of all of us across the church as we try to do church in brand new ways. It's remarkable what we're doing. Just in closing, I wanted to put up a statement that actually is reprinted in that BC document that Kathy helped to write. And I thought, when we're doing a program about risk assessment and how we move forward thinking about risk assessment, this is the place that we should probably be leaving it with. And pardon me while I turn away from the camera because it's on my screen over there. Bishop Karen Oliveto of the United Methodist Church said this: "I do not want one single case of COVID-19 traced to one of our churches because we didn't care for those whom Jesus loves." That's really what it's about. That's the risk assessment we have to do. We have to care for those whom Jesus loves. We have to do it with courage and with bravery and with wisdom and with care. And we have to do it safely for them and for ourselves and for all whom we serve. So with that, my sermon's done, and I want to wish you God's blessings on the ministry that you lead, and an opportunity for some rest in the middle of this crazy time as we move into the summer. And we'll look forward to convening again at a time to be determined as we watch how this all unfolds around us. Thanks for being part of this throughout the whole 11 weeks, and certainly for today as well. Bye for now.